Hello, saluton. Saluton al ciu. That means hello to everyone. This talk, Designing Joy, Gxoja Filozofio, Ancient Tamil Wisdom and Computational Thinking, was prepared ahead of a forthcoming event jointly sponsored by the IEEE Society of Chennai, the ACM Society of Chennai, the Computer Society of India, and the IEEE Life Members Affinity Group, or LMAG. In this session, I'll explore how ancient South Indian texts, particularly from Tamil literature, offer profound testable insights, the keyword being testable, into mental well-being. We'll reflect on how colonial and even post-colonial scholars misread these works, missing their psychological sophistication. And we'll examine how La Gioia Filosofio, a new practice-based philosophy, which aims to increase joy in our daily lives, helps us reinterpret these insights using the mindset of modern engineering and modern psychology. That includes pattern recognition, system design, happiness enhancing activities and tasks, and computational thinking. This is not a talk about religion or nostalgia. It's a talk about recovery and design, recovering what was overlooked and designing what comes next. This is essentially an act of remembering. It is an effort to say that not all that was said has been forgotten, and not all that was found has been forgotten. So the first section is really about rethinking Indian philosophy and history through Gxoja. And it is about the misunderstanding of India, and that could well serve even as the title of this section, The Misunderstanding of India. Let us begin with a silence that has lasted centuries, a silence created not by the absence of wisdom, but by the refusal to recognize it. When the British colonial enterprise entered India, it did not come as a student, it came as a self-declared master. The intention was not to listen, but to judge. No figure embodies this more starkly than Thomas Babington Macaulay, whose infamous 1835 minute on Indian education declared that, double quotes, a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. We must remember that many of these administrators were highly educated people. They were trained in English literature and the classics. To Macaulay, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Tirukkural, the Manimekhalai, the Jataka, they were all worthless because they did not conform to the empirical, material, and economic worldview of Victorian England. And again, we must remember, even Max Muller, although he may have been trained in linguistics and may have studied Sanskrit deeply, he simply did not have access to the later scientific experiments, which came only post my own first tenure in a graduate school, which was at the University of Wisconsin in the late 90s. Now, it must be remembered that Max Muller was, of course, a scholar, and his opinions must be treated like those of a scholar. But Thomas Babington Macaulay was in a position of power in India. And so what he said and what he did carried weight beyond mere words. It ended up changing the face of Indian education altogether. So when Thomas Babington Macaulay declared that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia, this was not merely ignorance, it was epistemic violence. Epistemic violence, and I'm using this complex terminology consciously because it was a systematic refusal to accept that another civilization might have developed its own methods of inquiry, ethics, and understanding of the self. But the misunderstanding didn't stop with the British. We now have to correct, a different type of an epistemic violence. In post-colonial India, a new kind of erasure took hold, a Marxist historicist lens that reduced religious and philosophical texts to ideological instruments. Rich inner practices were viewed as tools of caste oppression, feudal distraction, or, double quotes, false consciousness. Marx had already said that religion was the opiate of the masses. And like sheep, Marxist historians simply repeated that line and followed him like sheep follow a shepherd. They refused to use scientific methods of inquiry in asking why these extremely diverse rituals, practices, and traditions continued in India, despite the fact that Marx had already declared that religion was the opiate of the masses. Were these people all illiterate? So thus what really happened, that rich inner practices, as I said, were viewed as tools of caste oppression, feudal distractions, or double quotes, false consciousness. And in doing so, many Indian historians made the same mistakes as the colonialists. They ignored the inner world, and this includes Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, etc. But here is the quiet rebellion. While the courts of Delhi and London debated power and debated using terms like historiography, while the universities sorted history into neat materialist categories, millions of Indians quietly practiced Gxoja or joy. They chanted, they meditated, they gave food away, they fasted, they touched the feet of elders, They followed customs that, unbeknownst to them, were psychologically sophisticated. And that it was psychologically sophisticated may not have been known to them, but they must have surely experienced a certain level of joy. They followed customs, I repeat, that were psychologically sophisticated, methods for regulating emotion, cultivating compassion, transcending the ego, etc. And now scientific experiments are demonstrating, using highly scientific tools, p-values, etc., statistical tools, no doubt, that these are actually sophisticated psychological tools. So this first slide is not merely about how Indian philosophy has been misunderstood. It is about misinterpretation. It is about the invisibility of wisdom. So Gxoja Filozofio reframes Indian philosophy as practical and joyful. Gxoja, that word, it simply means joy in Esperanto. The focus is on intentional joy design, and Indian texts should be seen as mental training manuals. If we start delving into the Indian knowledge systems, this is what we find. The takeaway is that these are lived philosophies, not abstract speculation. And it is history seen through the eyes of the common man. And because the Marxist historicist lens refused to look at religion as having any social purpose, or essentially rejecting any social purpose, because Marx had analyzed it for them already, what they failed to see was they could have arrived at, and they did not arrive at, a people's history of South India. Popolo Historio da Sudha Bharata, which is what I would like to present to you. This is La Popola Historio da Sudha Bharata. Don't worry about the funny words. It is all science. And what I would like to ask is, what might our history and our future look like if we read our scriptures not as superstition, but as science in poetic form? Science in poetic form. And that brings me to section 2, the rise of scientific happiness. That is the title, or the rise of happiness science. So while that could be the title of this section, I've titled it Manimekhalai and Happiness Science. So what are we going to discover here? Well, let us see. We're going to discover that ancient Tamil texts align with modern psychology. They offer compassion training, they offer minimalism and detachment, and they offer mindfulness. This has been validated by researchers like Sonia Lyubomirsky and Martin Seligman. The takeaway is that evidence-based happiness is actually what the ancients were already doing. So while the colonial and post-colonial lens dismissed India's spiritual traditions as either irrational or regressive, something interesting was happening in another corner of the intellectual world. Starting in the late 20th century and gaining major traction in the early 2000s, psychologists, especially in the United States, began to shift their focus. Instead of asking only what makes people anxious, depressed, dysfunctional, with manifesting obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, etc., they begin to ask a radically simple question: what makes people truly sustainably happy? This movement, now known as positive psychology, was pioneered by thinkers like Martin Seligman, Sonia Lyubomirsky, Ed Diener, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I don't know if I've got the name right, but that is the best I can do. So Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Their work gave rise, my apologies to Mr. Csikszentmihalyi in advance, and his descendants, of course. So, you know, So where we were talking about this movement called positive psychology. Their work gave rise to what we now call the science of well-being. It's an empirical interdisciplinary exploration of what it means to flourish. And what are their findings? Strikingly aligned with ancient Indian traditions. Let's take a few core insights from this new science. This is science, believe me, and briefly unpack them. Number one, gratitude practice boosts long-term well-being. Studies by Sonia Lyubomirsky and Emmons showed that daily or weekly expressions of gratitude, that is, noticing and naming what one is thankful for, led to significant measurable increases in happiness. This mirrors centuries-old Indian practices, saying Anugraha or Kripa for blessings, touching the feet of elders, ritual offerings, and gratitude mantras. Many mantras express gratitude to various elements of nature. In fact, the Surya Namaskar, which is done as part of yoga, is a salutation to the sun. But when you cease to see the sun as something that is life-giving and take away the Surya aspect of it and simply think of it as a ball of fire, then you take away something from that gratitude practice. So what we are missing, although we may think that we are modern and we've got all these fancy tools, we essentially have dropped this veil of ignorance that we had about the sun, and we no longer think of it as anything but a ball of fire, which means that the daily or weekly expressions of gratitude are not really any more expressions of gratitude. They're merely ways to stretch your myofascial tissue. So what the happiness researchers have found is that gratitude practice actually boosts long-term well-being. So we have to add it back, maybe in a different way. And even the daily pradakshina or circumambulation or namaskaram is a bodily act of reverent acknowledgement. It is gratitude in motion. But when we have acquired all this scientific knowledge, we have unfortunately lost the ability to be thankful, say, to the sun or to Varuna. Walt Whitman was closer to this understanding when he praised the Varuna in the waters, because he knew that there is someone who needs to be praised for all this water, this abundance of water we have around us. The oceans. Oceans are life-giving and therefore are positive, and and should evoke a positive sentiment, and therefore Varuna deserves, in some abstract sense, our gratitude. What else has happiness science found? Mindfulness and non-attachment reduces suffering. Believe it or not, what the Buddhist said was actually absolutely right. Non-attachment reduces suffering. Mindfulness reduces suffering. There are now fancy terms for this. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, developed by John Kabat-Zinn, is now a global therapeutic practice. But its roots lie squarely in Buddhist Vipassana meditation and Vedantic awareness of Sakshi, or the inner witness. The principle of Vairagya, or non-attachment, is not about indifference, and it is really about not being too attached. It is about not being ruled by craving and aversion. And this concept is echoed in cognitive behavioral therapy and emotional regulation research. The exact same concepts. Number three, acts of kindness and altruism raise happiness levels, as researchers are now finding. Sonia Lyubomirsky's experiments show that people who perform kind acts for others, even small ones, experience a boost in positive emotion and life satisfaction, or they experienced, in her experiments. Indian traditions are saturated with this ethic. For instance, there is a concept of seva, which is selfless service, dana, which is charity, and karuna, which is compassion. They're not only moral ideals, they're psychological tools for sustaining meaning. And as it says somewhere, if you want to see a monument, just look around you. So where does one find monuments like this? Well, you just have to look around you. Si monumentum requiris circumspice. And I don't know Latin, and I'm not very sure how to pronounce it, but my forte is more Esperanto, Sanskrit, Hindi, etc. So, or rather, Esperanto-based ConLang, Sanskrit, Hindi, etc. So, look around you, look at the step wells. Look, why did they build those step wells? Did they build the step wells because they got bored? Why would someone build something that had a very obvious social function, which is conserving water, right? We see so many examples of seva, dana, and karuna all over, all over India. Just look at the monuments. Look at the monuments. And I won't have time to touch upon that topic of how monuments embody this concept of charity, but if I have time, I might cover it as part of my IEEE talk. Let's move on to number four. A sense of meaning outweighs momentary pleasure, it turns out. Viktor Frankl and later contemporary researchers have emphasized the importance of meaning making over pleasure for long-term fulfillment. Indian texts never confuse joy with indulgence. True joy, or ananda, comes from alignment with dharma, which is inner integrity, not external gain. And this is echoed in the Bhagavad Gita and Tirukkural and Manimekhalai. And Manimekhalai is a Buddhist epic. And when we look at the analysis of Manimekhalai, we might go to Wikipedia and we might find a lot of scholarly analysis on Manimekhalai. But this scholarly analysis is from the 20th century or the 21st century. Then the question arises, why are we privileging these scholars over the people of the Sangam era and of ancient Tamil Nadu who saw some value in these epics? Why is it that if someone has got a PhD in, say, South Asian studies, that automatically means that they have to come in with more authority? Or does it automatically mean that they know more? We know that Kamil Zvelabel, he called Manimekhalai, he called this epic Manimekhalai, Kamil Zvelabel, he called it Buddhist propaganda. But if you actually study the epic deeply, it is not propaganda at all. In fact, it is very similar to Buddhist epics not only in India but also in Southeast Asia. We see such a huge level of commonality that even the contemporaries of Sitalai Satana, the person who wrote Manimekhalai, would not have confused it for propaganda. They knew very well what Manimekhalai was doing. It was advancing Buddhist ideas. It was intended to do so. And the whole concept of these Buddhist ideas was to reduce dukkha, or reduce what is loosely translated as suffering, but really increase happiness. So these practices like mindfulness, etc., were discovered by these monks, and now they are being repackaged and resold from the West, maybe with patent protection. So here's the paradox. The very practices modern psychology now recommends: gratitude, mindfulness, detachment, compassion, meaning making. Every single one of them finds echo in the Tamil text and in the Sanskrit text. And they're the very ones embedded in the so-called irrational religious texts that colonial thinkers dismissed. In other words, what the Enlightenment overlooked, science is now rediscovering. Are we, Bharatvarsha, going to march into the 21st century saying that we're going to have to borrow it all from the West, we're going to like not just consider yoga nidra, which we invented, as our own, but call it non-sleep deep rest? Are we going to take other terms which are basically Indian ideas, MBSR, mindfulness based stress reduction, which is just nothing but Vipassana meditation plus plus, right? Or Vipassana meditation prime, a little bit extra, that's about it. It's just basically that. Are we going to now say we're going to have to like pay for those patterns? Is that not cultural appropriation? So again, I would like to put it very simply. I would like to characterize the state of affairs simply like this. What the Enlightenment overlooked, science is now rediscovering. But in doing so, it is often giving new names to old truths. What we call prayer, it calls intention setting. What we call satsang, it calls group therapy. What we call puja, it calls ritual affirmation. So we ask again, what happens when we stop outsourcing validation from the West and start re-listening to the quiet knowledge we have carried all along? So I am intending to challenge colonial and Marxist readings. But let's go back to Manimekhalai. What is so great about Manimekhalai? Well, if the Vedas sang of transcendence and the Upanishads whispered about the self, it was in the classical Tamil canon and other parts, other Buddhist canon, that the poetry of lived happiness is most elegantly captured. Enter Manimekhalai, the 2,000-year-old Buddhist. I believe it's 2,000 years old. Let's not debate the numbers. None of it really matters for the main points that I'm making. People have suggested that Manimekhalai could have been composed after Silabikalam, maybe in the 2nd or 3rd century, etc., etc. It doesn't matter because the p-values, the social science experiments, they are forever. It does not matter if it was even written like 200 years ago. So enter Manimekhalai. I'm sorry, when I'm speaking in English, I tend to use an English accent. Even perhaps a little bit of an American accent. Sorry, my apologies for that. It is Manimekhalai. So enter Manimekhalai, the 2,000-year-old Buddhist epic composed in Tamil by the poet Seethalai Sadhana, written during the height of Tamilagam's golden era. This text is not merely literature, it is a manual for a meaningful life, disguised as a spiritual and social odyssey. The story centers around Manimekhalai, the daughter of the courtesan Madhavi and the noble Kovalan. Yes, the same Kovalan from Silapadigaram. But unlike her parents, Manimekhalai chooses renunciation. She turns away from worldly love, wealth, and palace life, not out of disdain, but out of compassion. And it almost like makes sense that someone who's Buddhist who writes such a story, because you can see that the end of Silapadigaram is not very, it's not very, Jaya. It ends in like the whole city of Madurai burning, right? So what the Buddhists do, they quietly insert this epic saying this is a sequel to Manimekhalai and add a Hollywood style ending where Manimekhalai comes and everybody lives happily ever after. And Manimekhalai seeks a deeper happiness and she discovers it in Buddhism. And ultimately, what Seethalai Satana really truly seems to believe, you can read it very clearly in the text. He believes that the Buddhist practices are really where it is at. And that is a perfectly reasonable point of view, as I have discovered numerous people in Sacramento, California declare that Buddhism is where it's at. That is where you're going to find happiness. So this is Sacramento in the 21st century. So let us look at, what Manimekhalai is trying to convey. Number one, the magic bowl, the Amudasurabi in Tamil. It is the magic bowl. It's a metaphor for ethical abundance. So at the heart of Manimekhalai's journey is the Amudasurabi, which is a divine bowl that never runs out of food. But it only works when feeding the hungry. So in this single symbol, the text weaves together multiple threads. Material sufficiency is possible without greed. Number one. Number two, compassion sustains abundance, not hoarding. And true wealth is not what you keep, but what you circulate. And modern behavioral science tells us that generosity increases oxytocin and reduces stress. But Manimekhalai already taught this through story, not through spreadsheets. And this ethic is captured over and over again in the Buddhist texts. It is but obvious to anyone who has studied Buddhism at all that Amudasurabi, the divine bowl that never runs out of food, is a metaphor for generosity. Number two, that is the Amudasurabi. That is one of the most famous items in Manimekhalai. So I wanted to reference that. Number two, non-violence is inner ecology. Unlike the epics of war, Mahabharata, the Iliad, etc., Manimekhalai is a text of peace. And that is why a lot of people even say it's barely a story. And in fact, one Tamil scholar said, well, there isn't even a story here. I don't see much of a story. And there really isn't much of a story because unless you understand Sitalai Sadhana, the way he was approaching it, and we really have to get into the minds of Sitalai Sadhana. We have to get in the minds of the Buddhists. For them, you know, they didn't believe in violence. So all they can really do is put this text forward and say, this is what you guys should be reading. And Buddhists for generations have rediscovered the value of the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, etc. And in fact, Manimekhalai also, refers to these things, the Arya Satyani, etc. So, as far as Sridhar Sadhana is concerned, he has created a work of art, he has created a work of beauty, and he has referenced the Buddhist text, which offers the framework. And he feels he's done his job, and all the people around him thought he'd done a fantastic job. They called it one of the great epics. And here is Kamal Zwelabil. He is questioning whether it is Buddhist propaganda. It is not Buddhist propaganda. That is because Buddhism is a theory of consciousness properly understood. So if you refuse to follow that line of understanding, which we have now developed, then you're going to see it as propaganda. But if you see it the way the Tamils did, then it is not propaganda. It is merely it's sort of like a professor talking about, maybe flow. Maybe like Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow and he says how wonderful it is. It is no different from that. It is a school of thought that's being advanced. So, unlike the epics of war, like I said, Manimekhalai is a text of peace, and the protagonist seeks not to fight enemies but to transform sufferings. Manimekhalai visits prisons, poorhouses, and port cities, not to convert or conquer, but to witness and serve. This ethic aligns seamlessly with the La Joya principle that joy is relational. That is what psychologists are saying now. This ethic aligns seamlessly with Gxoja philosophy, which is that joy is relational. As the Buddha says in the text, he who brings joy to others will have no need to chase it for himself. Today, trauma psychologists are emphasizing the healing power of service, but Manimekhalai offered it 2 millennia ago. Number three, happiness is practice, not accident. The Manimekhalai doesn't just describe moments of joy, it describes disciplines of joy, what I call comprehensive happiness enhancing activities and tasks. This includes meditation and withdrawal from distraction, study and reflection on suffering, ethical conduct and social responsibility, inner detachment from praise or blame. This mirrors what positive psychology, a scientific discipline, calls intentional activities for well being. Repeated chosen behaviors that shape the brain and the heart. In La Gxoja Filozofio, we call this the Gxoja discipline, a practice of choosing joy, not as naive optimism, but as intentional activities or intensia agadoi, as an act of intelligent resistance to despair or to dukkha. Now, the set of activities we recommend are more numerous than what was available to the Buddhists because we now know that there are certain activities that done in a certain way are going to confer more happiness, etc. But the idea is the same, it's just that we don't live like Buddhist monks, and so we have more stresses come from the outside world, and therefore we need to have more tools and better tools. And number four, it is Manimekhalai represents a feminine ethic of joy. Unlike the male-dominated sagas of conquest, Manimekhalai is led by a woman whose joy is derived not from domination, but from clarity, kindness, and purpose. And that is why it slips through our fingers. We don't even see what they're trying to say because we don't see, like in the superhero movies, somebody fighting someone else and beating them up. And that person, of course, rises back and beats up the first person. And it goes on and on and on. And after having watched, trust me, a lot of Marvel movies, I've watched a whole bunch of them. I can tell you, I remember almost nothing because they all tend to bleed into each other and they're mostly about the same. The two people, there are two parties, they tend to fight, they tend to have a reason to fight and they tend to fight, then one of them wins. And at this point, I don't even know if Batman and Superman are on good terms or on friendly terms. And whether civil war has been declared in Gotham City, it barely even registers anymore because far more elegantly, far more elegantly than this was Manimekhalai. Because it is a person whose joy is derived, as I said, not from domination, but from clarity, kindness, and purpose. And because Manimekhalai is led by such a person, it challenges both patriarchal and colonial narratives. It tells us that joy is not a reward for the privileged, it's the birthright of the aware. So we must ask, why did colonial translators ignore this text? Why do most Indian school children never read it? Perhaps because its power lies not in triumph or drama, but in quiet radical compassion. And this makes Manimekhalai not only an Indian classic and a Tamil classic, but also a Gxoja classic. It is a map to the geography of inner flourishing. So, by doing so, we are challenging these colonial and Marxist readings because you can read Derrida all you want. All he has really done is he's just asked if a single sentence can have two different meanings. And no matter how much you think of Derrida as a philosopher, more or less it can be boiled down to this. So, as a scientist, you have to ask, my dear Derrida, Monsieur Derrida, Miss Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, où est les p-values? Where are the p-values? Where is the science? Did you simply ignore the psychological richness of Indian culture? And I believe they did. They missed the emotional training offered by Buddhism and Hinduism. They missed the joy-oriented practices. And what the Gxoja Filozofio proudly boasts is that we can reclaim the text through a joy-focused lens. And simply by saying every text can have two different interpretations, or two or three or whatever, and it depends on who is on power, does not a science make. So if we can simply stop revering Jacques Derrida because he's got a French name and a lot of stuff in French, which sounds really sophisticated, let us not forget how cool the Sanskrit-based stuff is, how cool this Pali-based stuff is. So this is essentially practical wisdom for the 21st century. So that brings me to section 4, from Tamil Sangam to global Gxoja. We are now on the topic of global Gxoja. We are saying that this is the rebirth of a joyful philosophy because in the shade of palm trees and the sound of temple bells, Tamil poets once composed verses not of conquest but of inner victory. They spoke of the beauty of restraint, the nobility of compassion, and the quiet ecstasy of the everyday. As they say, before enlightenment, draw water, chop wood. After enlightenment, draw water, chop wood. This is the sentiment that you see in Manimekhalai. It is about very everyday people. So although Wendy Doniger set out on this epic quest to rescue Hinduism from the people who she said are the people in authority, it turns out that many of the people who wrote these Tamil classics and this Tamil poetry were very humble people. Tiruvallur was a weaver. He was a humble weaver. It is well known that he came from a very humble background. And similarly, these monks were not exactly like, fortune finder CEOs. They didn't have a lot of power. They were sitting in their monasteries. And so any type of joy that they could bring had to be through simple, polishing of these jewels that we have, these jewels of Tamil poetry. So these Tamil poets composed words not of conquest but of inner victory, and this was Sangam wisdom. It was fluid, it was embodied, it was deeply human, and it was deeply humane. And for a time, the world forgot it. But we're beginning to remember, as we can see, channels like Buddhism in English now have tens of thousands of subscribers. People are rediscovering Buddhism, maybe from monks in Sri Lanka, maybe from monks in India, but they're beginning to rediscover Buddhist wisdom, and we're beginning to remember. We're going to realize that Gxoja practices like kindness or joyful environments, they're all echoed in Buddhist texts, in Indian practices. So, across the globe today, I believe a subtle shift is occurring. In psychology labs, in mindfulness retreats, in resilience research, and spiritual communities, we are rediscovering truths that were once sung under the southern stars, that happiness is cultivated, not consumed. That's number one. Number two, that the self is not an island, but a wave. Number three, that freedom comes not from having more, but from needing less. Number four, the joy, far from being frivolous, is a form of a resistance against despair, against cynicism, and the reduction of life to metrics, and the reduction of knowledge to ChatGPT consumable text. This is where La Gxoja Filozofio finds its voice. It is not a rejection of science, but its deepening. Here are some Gxoja practices. Morning pause. I choose joy today. You just pause for some time and you say you choose joy for that day. You do a joy audit. You do a gratitude audit. You look at things that you're grateful for. You look at things you're joyous about. You go on silent walks. You practice kindness. You try to create joyful environments. This is not a nostalgic return to the past. That is far from what we are advocating, but a reweaving of wisdom and data. It is a reweaving of Tamil literature, Buddhist ethics, and neuroscience into what we'd like to consider one luminous thread. So, Gxoja is not escape, it is engagement. So, to be a Gxoja philosophy or to be a Gxoja philosopher or to practice the Gxoja philosophy is not to be perpetually cheerful. Rather, it is to be awake. It is to be awake, like the Buddha said one should be awake. Although we by no means think that Buddhism in and of itself is a complete system. This system was developed by me, and I can say that the Buddhist systems are not necessarily, the Buddhist practices are not the only ones you should practice. You can adopt as many of them as you want, but there are so many more happiness practices that you can adopt. So, to be a Gxoja philosopher or to practice the Gxoja philosophy is to be awake, even when the world is weeping. It is to choose kindness in a cruel moment. It is to breathe slowly when the world speeds up. It is to see beauty even in endings and to smile not out of ignorance but out of deep understanding. It is a philosophy for the world to come. And it really is that. It really is that. It is, there is a way to link the Gxoja philosophy, even to computational thinking. And this is, of course, computers, of course, were invented only in the 20th century. So, at least the real practical computers on a mass scale, right? So, you know, we're talking about a philosophy for the world to come. We're talking about, you know, what we should do as AI seems to unsettle all of us. It seems to be able to do a lot of the tasks that we thought were the sole domain of human beings. So, as AI reshapes work, as climate shifts unsettle our assumptions, as isolation becomes epidemic, what will matter most? It is not GDP, it is not stock prices, it is not conquest, but these Gxoja practices connection, meaning, the felt experience of joy, shared and sustainable. In this, La Gxoja Filozofio is both ancient and radical. It says, let the economy grow, but let the heart not shrink. That's number one. Number two, let us innovate, but let's also inward wait. Let us innovate in an inward way. Number three, let us reimagine the good life, not as having more money or having more material goods, but as being more deeply present. So we return full circle from the misunderstood wisdom of the subcontinent to its reawakening. The Tamil poets have not vanished. Their verses are not dead. They simply needed a new language to sing again. And I am developing new languages for that as well. In La Gxoja Filozofio, they find that voice. The bowl of Manimekhalai, the bowl of Manimekhalai. Here is my little bit of verse on that topic. The bowl of Manimekhalai still overflows. The world is still hungry. Let us feed it not only with food, but with joy. So, the Gxoja Manifesto, which I have developed, is a call to gentle revolution. It's a new philosophy for an age of uncertainty rooted in ancient joy. What is philosophy for, after all, if it is not to help us live, right? I have covered the La Gxoja Filozofio and the La Gxoja Manifesto on the La Gxoja website. And I will say this, we do not need new gods, we do not need new rulers, we do not need new monarchs. We need new stories about what it means to live well, and La Gxoja offers one story that joy is not selfish, that meaning is not elite. And it simply says that ancient texts like Manimekhalai, the Tirukkural, the Dhammapada, they hold truths that science is now only catching up to right now. So it is not luxury, it is infrastructure. So, some final thoughts before I move on to the section on computational thinking. The final thoughts go something like this. India was never fully understood by its colonizers, but now the world is listening again. We have the chance not only to reclaim the heritage of India, but to re-gift it joyfully to a future that is starving really for soul. So La Gxoja Filozofio is not just a philosophy, it is a lantern. So carry it well, pass it on, and light someone else's path. And now that brings me to section 6, computational thinking and Gxoja. So, as we reflect on this journey from ancient Tamil wisdom to modern happiness science, and now into the realm of computational thinking, we arrive at an intriguing question. Can joy be designed? Can it be thought of not merely as a fleeting emotion, but as the result of structured, repeatable mental habits, much like the algorithms we write in code? And the answer is yes, joy is programmable. Ancient practices were really modular algorithms, as it says in the slide. Gxoja is about cognitive resets. So, what do we have to debug? We have to debug things like ego, distraction, and tension. We have to find out what are causing these things. And we have to apply a different type of a lens, a computational lens. We have to refactor habits. We have to design joy systems. So, when we look at the practices from Buddhism, or Hinduism, the mindfulness rituals from Buddhism or the meditation rituals in Hinduism, they resemble small testable procedures in computer science, right? Each one does something specific, calming the breath, refocusing the mind, increasing compassion. They're modular, low cost, and they're self-contained. They're hallmarks of good code, right? So what if these practices are not just cultural artifacts, but early expressions, really, of cognitive algorithms? What if they were practices meant to reliably produce states of well-being? This is where computational thinking enters the picture. It encourages to break problems into parts, identify patterns, and iterate towards better outcomes. So in Gxoja, we do something similar. We break life into habits, activities, and tasks. We search for patterns of joys, and we identify those happiness-enhancing activities and tasks that have been shown by science to increase what is called subjective well-being in the literature. What is subjective well-being? It is nothing but a synonym for the term happiness. If you want to sound scientific, you might say subjective well-being, but really it is what the Buddha was referring to as lack of dukkha. And just like debugging code, we can debug our days, we can test different inputs and see what outputs they produce. So in this way, the Gxoja approach doesn't just honor ancient insight, it also speaks in the language of modern engineering. So the question I leave you with is this: if joy is a discipline, can it also be debugged? And if so, what would your personal joy function look like? And that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I hope you got a little something out of it. And as you say in Esperanto, gis la revido.